This is the
Five Starr
Podcast.
Let me talk to you. This is such good shit. What do you guys want to talk about?
Change of plans for this week. I was not expecting to be doing the show we're about to do today, but hey, you know what? I'm actually kind of glad it worked out that way. When I looked at what's coming out for the next week, I'm starting to think I was about to overload myself with all the wrestling content in the next 7 days. I will touch on all of that momentarily, not that you already can't tell by the title of the podcast today. It is definitely not a standard Monday show for the FSWR channel. Still the same person operating the show, however. My energy levels are always hit and miss. I am currently bordering on tired, more so hitting my stride on goofy tired. My brain is on. The gears are turning. I don't know entirely in which direction, but definitely got some stuff to discuss for today, so I'm running on fumes, but I'm going to do my best. I have a cup of coffee sitting in my hand here, so that's always good. It means my fuel levels are high. For how long, I have no idea. Maybe just long enough to get me through SmackDown without gouging my eyeballs out. Especially after that show I just watched over the weekend. Good God in heaven. Talk about doing everything to actively try and run me off and never have me look back. I was actually thinking about trying to start the review this week with SmackDown, but I think the bigger news bulletin right now is going to stem from the Retro series. So why don't we go ahead and just dive right into it? And I need to provide some context before we get going with everything, so bear with me as I explain. I guess you could call this my Vince Russo swerve for the month. Remember how I said this weekend was going to be a moderately normal weekend for the podcast? Well, I lied. Because apparently I just don't learn my lessons when it comes to looking ahead and making sure all of my ducks are in a row. I said we were going to review Retro Raw and SmackDown for this coming Monday. Here I sit. No Retro Raw show to report on. And, well, then I also realized that next week it was going to be a more packed show because had things worked out how I initially intended, we would have had to discuss the 1994 King of the Ring, Retro Raw, SmackDown, and the AEW Collision debut all in one episode. And I think it was purely through an act of God that those plans have now changed because, well, sure enough, I went ahead and tried to go to the Peacock library to find the next episode of Retro Raw. Turns out they didn't actually air an episode of Monday Night Raw from June 13th, 1994. There was apparently some kind of TV special they aired, one of those studio presentation hype packages for the King of the Ring pay-per-view. I don't know if they ever uploaded it or archived it anywhere on Peacock. There were some clips I found on YouTube, and I mean, it basically narrowed down to one of those in-studio discussion panels where they just covered all the storylines, pretty much what Todd Pettingill's been doing on all the Raw shows, except less Caucasian. And I figured since that was probably not going to be worth our time recapping, and again, since next week is already shaping up to be a jam-packed Monday show anyway, I figure we ought to splice up some of the content. Why not? So in short, We're doing the King of the Ring review this week. Even though the show technically happened on June 19th, 1994, we're going to run down and talk about the highlights of the show and get it over with now. The highlights and the lowlights. Should be a little more specific there. And then we'll talk about SmackDown afterwards. It'll still be a lengthier show, but instead of making next week a 3.5-hour podcast and trying to cram in 3 TV shows plus a pay-per-view recap, we're just going to focus on the SmackDown, Retro, Raw, and Collision shows next week, and I think that'll be a better use of my time. That should also preserve my sanity somewhat, because, Lord knows I was ever going to make room to actually sit down and try to watch this King of the Ring special at any point in the week. I figured since today, which is Sunday, I'm recording this now a little later in the evening, but I figured Sunday was a pretty chill day for me, so, I had an entire afternoon to kind of sit down and watch it. Plus, it was going to be fresh on my mind after having seen it, so, yeah, whatever, let's just get it out of the way, and we'll talk about the follow-up Retro Raw next week, and try to stay consistent with the Retro recaps, because I'm still trying to follow within the timeline, at least in terms of the dates. And I'll kind of outline how I would want to break the show down, because typically the King of the Ring pay-per-views were known for having a lot of matches on the card back in the day. When you count all the tournament matches, plus all the other title matches that were spliced throughout the card, it usually equated to a pay-per-view where there would be a lot of shorter matches. Like, most of the prelims were pretty unmemorable, and you were mostly just fixated on the finals of the actual tournament, because that's really the only thing that mattered at the end of the day. So as we run down the opening round matches for the King of the Ring, don't be offended that I briefly gloss over a lot of them. Truth be told, you're really not missing out on a whole lot. Kind of like how you're really not missing out with a whole lot of this pay-per-view to begin with. And for those wondering, I always like to do this at the top of the reports. The show took place at the CFG Bank Arena in Baltimore. I believe seating capacity for that venue ranges somewhere in the ballpark of 14,000. And the attendance for this show was numbered to be about 12,000. So they damn near packed the place, which is almost astonishing considering A, how terrible business was by this point, and B, the overall lackluster card on paper. Looking back, they may have popped some additional ticket sales or buys for the Lawler-Piper match, which, again, was its own separate entity entirely and had nothing to do with the actual King of the Ring tournament. But, beyond that, we had the WWF Championship match with Brett and Diesel that we'll talk about. What I tagline, the title match that nobody remembered. And we'll address more of that as we approach the actual match, because there was more to say about that fiasco, beyond the fact that it was totally forgettable. But we will build up to it. And as usual with these shows, they have the whole pomp, circumcision, and pyro, as I like to call it. The whole national anthem special, all the opening VTRs and things like that. But we'll go ahead and skip to the actual opening round match. Bam Bam Bigelow and Razor Ramon, the highlight of which was hearing Art Donovan as the special color commentator, totally out to lunch and having no idea what to say or do for the entirety of the night. Meanwhile, Macho Man's there the entire time, basically telling him to just sit there, shut up, and let Savage guide him through. Really should have taken that advice by the time this pay-per-view was over. Now, for those that don't know, for those sitting there asking, who is Art Donovan? Well, quite frankly, I didn't really know. The name sounded familiar. I knew he was some kind of sports guy. He was a retired football player. I believe he was living in Baltimore at the time. And again, we all know how WWF loved their celebrity special guests. Even if the guys or gals had zero wrestling knowledge whatever, as we found out from WrestleMania 10. And Art Donovan knew as much about calling a wrestling match as I do trying to call a football game. Next to nothing. And it showed. His contributions to the commentary team were very much on par with how Tony Schiavone calls most AEW matches, adding nothing of value aside from random outcries of, "Wow, how exciting," or "This is great, guys, I'm just happy to be here." That was the extent of what he provided as a commentator. If you watch the match on mute and ignore everything about the commentary, I mean, the wrestling was solid. For relatively bigger guys, Bam Bam and Razor were two of the more agile big guys they had on the roster at this time. I mean, they only got about 8 minutes to work with, but again, this is kind of the norm when you go back and watch a lot of these King of the Ring pay-per-views. Because there were more matches to get through in a 3-hour window, a lot of the prelim rounds are going to be shorter. They're going to be faster paced, but really just not a whole lot to note about the matches. Sometimes that's a good thing. It was surely a good thing when you take into account the next match, IRS versus Mabel. This match sucked. Luckily, it only went about 5 minutes, and about 3 of those 5 minutes consisted of IRS doing a Heat promo and Men on a Mission doing another one of their generic bad raps. I did note the one spot here where Mabel attempted a small cradle on Rotunda and essentially spiked him right on top of his head. Made even better by the fact that as the ref goes down to try and count the pinfall, IRS was supposed to kick out, but because Mabel was so huge, IRS didn't really have a lot of wiggle room to throw a shoulder up. So I think the ref just kind of stopped counting to make sure the match kept going. Otherwise, I think Mabel would have actually had IRS pinned as a shoot. Anyway, Mabel was totally blown up by the end. He semi-botched a boss man slam, and right as he tried to go up to the middle rope to do something, as I wrote down, I wasn't entirely sure, IRS ended up jiggling the rope so Mabel would end up losing his balance, and then Rotunda stole the pin by locking his feet under the bottom rope. Yeah, think about that for a minute, too. Here's a little nugget of knowledge for you. Mabel in 1994, losing in the opening round King of the Ring match to IRS. Fast forward 1 year later, winner of the 1995 King of the Ring. My, how the landscape of the business changes very quickly. Oh yeah, and Art Donovan's commentary was abysmal beyond belief. And that trend continued through pretty much the entirety of the show. Good fucking God. And see, here's the thing. Normally, a competent person would have pulled the plug on Art Donovan's headset the moment he opened his yap hole in the opening match. These jagoffs never figured it out. They let this guy sit there through the whole fucking pay-per-view. At one point, you could even tell Savage was getting visibly pissed. I thought he was about ready to choke the dude out. I mean, really, if you go back and think about this entire King of the Ring special, I would just advise anybody to watch the whole thing with no audio. I mean, the Donovan stuff made it virtually impossible to enjoy anything, including this next match with Tatanka and Owen Hart. Takes a lot of skill to get me to actively hate an Owen Hart match, but I think Art Donovan's commentary managed to pull it off. Again, watch the thing on mute. The wrestling's fine. It's pretty much the story of the entire show. The finish of this was awesome, though. The entire last 3 minutes is Tatanka getting near fall after near fall, pin attempt after pin attempt on Owen. He hits like 17 moves in a row on the guy. And right as he goes to Irish whip Owen off the ropes for a sunset, Owen just sits down on Tatanka's shoulders and pins him. Just like that. It's like, boy, way to make Tatanka look like a dork. Give him a big flurry of offense at the end there and then cut his balls out from under him with one flash pin. The downward trajectory of poor Tatanka. It just continues and continues. So, well, the final of the opening prelim rounds was Double J versus the 1-2-3 Kid. Out of the 4 opening round matches, this was probably the best of the bunch, which I know is faint praise when you consider that the other 3 matches were probably hovering somewhere in the 1.25 star range, if you actually buy into that system. Definitely had the most heat of the 4 opening round matches. I mean, you basically had Jeff beating up Shawn for the entire match. Shawn made a little comeback at the end. He went for a running attack in the corner, but when Jeff moved out of the way, Kid came up selling his right knee. And right as Jeff went for the figure 4, Kid turned that into a small package and scored the upset. And with Jeff not taking too kindly to being duped, he ended up spiking Waltman with 3 consecutive pile drivers. I wrote down in big bold print, overkill much? A little exploitive of the business, don't we think? But, now, you know, Jeff's obviously getting booed out of the building. And the announcers kind of mentioned how it sets up an interesting story for the semifinal round, with the 1-2-3 Kid still being slated to wrestle Owen. Now they got that lingering injury story going on, so they're unsure if Waltman was going to be medically cleared to compete. So we will find out what happens later on. A theme. Ooh. Riveting. Speaking of riveting, somehow they did it. So, like, the entire first hour was just moderately underwhelming, middle-of-the-road Raw matches. And then, following that, full pay-per-view price that I had to pay for this, Bret the Hitman Hart versus Diesel for the WWF title. And I'll tell you what, I've said it before, I was never the biggest Bret guy growing up, but the older I get, the more I go back and watch his tapes, the more I appreciate the things he was capable of doing from a workhorse standpoint. The fact that he was able to carry Diesel to a remotely watchable WWF title match in 1994, that was not an easy task. Now, well, first things first, they threw in another wrinkle to this little title match, Delia Bob. After the incident on the King's Court segment a few weeks ago, where Bret got powerbombed by Nash and more or less triple teamed by him, Shawn, and Lawler, now Bret is going into this with a game plan. He's flown a family member out to watch his back and make sure that Shawn did not stick his nose in the middle of things again. And who should that surprise family member turn out to be but his old tag team partner, Jim the Anvil Neidhart. They teased from the beginning of the pay-per-view that somebody was going to be out there watching Bret's back. And when he came out here, got a big reaction from the Baltimore fans. And you obviously figured the Anvil would wind up being somehow factored into the finish, and we'll talk about that rigmarole in a minute or two. As a match, you know, I think it's pretty safe to say, if the narrative from WrestleMania 10 is that Shawn had a match with a ladder and Razor was just along for the ride, I'm chalking this one up to Bret having a passable wrestling match with a giant bull in a china shop and still making it work. Even though Kevin Nash was essentially a guy with 2 left feet out there, Bret wasn't phoning it in. He said, I'm getting something out of this fucking guy, by hook or by crook. God love him for it. And you know, while they definitely threw some smoke and mirrors stuff in there with all the Shawn Neidhart stuff on the floor, I gotta say, the actual wrestling with Diesel and Bret wasn't horrible. Yeah, like the middle heat portion towed the line, anywhere from mind-numbing to borderline sleep-inducing. I mean, the only real noticeable botch in the match was when Bret was coming off the ropes toward Diesel, and when Diesel went to try and catch him in a bear hug, both guys just sort of fell down. But again, you needed throw in some additional spices to keep the match from totally bogging down. Shawn was good as the Weasley prick on the floor, running distractions behind Hebner's back. Anvil was good, trying to work the equalizer role, but kept having run-ins with the ref too. They did the exposed turnbuckle spot where Nash went to try and throw Brett face first onto the steel, but Brett countered that. And of course, Hebner didn't see it because he was distracted with Neidhart. He was also selling his knee from a bump they did a minute prior. And of course, Diesel's doing the solid job throwing the woozy windmill punches, as I like to coin the term. Brett's ducking and firing back on Diesel. He ends up hitting Diesel with a middle rope bulldog. Diesel actually kind of took a really cool bump for it too. Almost did like a full roll through so he could land on his back. And that set up Brett for the sharpshooter, but Shawn hit the ring apron again to run a distraction. So Brett gives him a nice right hand, and Shawn takes the over-dramatic pratfall off the ring apron onto the guardrail. Fans at this point are erupting. I'm about 3 seconds away from coining this the best match of Kevin Nash's career. Up to this point, it probably was. And while they're doing some near falls at the end, we get the actual finish. And I've been praising and building up to this climax so much, you almost had to know it was inevitably going to fall flat. And it kind of did. They do a spot where Shawn hits the ring and hits Brett over the back with the WWF title. And that was preceded by a spot moments earlier where Diesel was on the floor and ended up shoving Neidhart into the ring post. Couldn't remember entirely what led up to that, but all I remember is Nash shoved Neidhart, so he goes down selling. Shawn hits Brett from behind with the belt. That got a near fall when Nash went for the cover. And about a minute later, Diesel goes to do the jackknife on Brett. And as he goes for the pin, he's immediately broken up by Neidhart running in and attacking Diesel for the blatant DQ. And obviously the fucked finish with the heel going over was going to piss off the fans. The bigger story, however, was everything involving Neidhart after the bell. Because right after jumping Nash, he basically cuts tail and runs. He goes straight to the locker room. Meanwhile, Brett is in the ring getting pummeled by the heels. And the announcers are obviously drawing attention to it. So you figured this would end up playing into a central theme for later on, and it certainly did. But the way it was executed, it was very weird. Like, the Anvil just walks out unceremoniously, and we're all just sitting there like, dude, your brother-in-law is currently getting savagely beaten up right now. Maybe you want to go back and help him out? I guess the Anvil got his education from the School of Roman. Professor Reigns teaching Neidhart how to properly turn your back on the bloodline. In 1994. He was way ahead of the curve. Now, before I go ahead and spoil any more of what's to come later on, we should probably move on with the card. But just to put a finishing bow on this match, I talked in the lead up to this show how I had like no memory of this Diesel Brett match ever happening in King of the Ring 94. It was definitely not a bad title match. I expected way worse than what we got. I was almost expecting to give it some sort of dud rating just because my expectations were so low. But they ended up surprising me by the end. I thought in terms of my expectations going in, it was a lot better than what I was giving it credit for. When you look back in hindsight, it might have been one of the better matches on the card. Toss-up between that and the finish to the Owen Razor King of the Ring final. But, yeah. Got to give Nash credit. He definitely went out there and worked hard. Again, Brett carried a lot of the action here, but Diesel held his own. I mean, he still had a point to prove at this point in his career. He was definitely not, NWO version Kevin Nash by this period where he just totally gave up trying. Maybe this was the match that sold Vince on running with him as the champion later on in the year. Wouldn't doubt it for a second. So at that point, we sort of turned our attention back to the tournament for a while. Semi-final round with IRS versus Razor. Two guys that had prior history dating back to earlier in the year, and a lot of that kind of got glossed over here. But I'm old enough to remember. My God. The immeasurable level of go-away heat that Art Donovan had with me at this point was unreal. And you know the thing that sucks? I can't even blame him. This was not his fault. The blame goes on whoever decided that he was the right guy to bring in to be a special color guy. Whoever made that judgment call, I hope they were immediately fired. And if it was Vince's idea, then shame on him. You should have known better. Anyway, I was on the can taking a shit during this match. So I was away from my computer and didn't have the availability to type notes up. Didn't really miss all that much. Both guys went back and forth for a while until Razor won with the Razor's Edge. There's literally nothing else to say about it. Nor was there a whole lot to say about the next semifinal round, Owen Hart versus the 1-2-3 Kid. Now again, the story going in was trying to determine whether or not Waltman was going to be healthy enough to compete after the Jarrett attack. And, they milked the entrance for the Kid until he came hobbling and wobbling down the aisleway, almost out of breath, still selling the effects from earlier. And, they did the hot jump start with Owen torpedoing through the middle rope and taking out Waltman. Good fun-paced action with Owen just kind of taking the fight to Waltman and not giving him a lot of margin for error. One of the more notable spots was when Waltman hit Owen with the Northern Lights suplex near the ropes, and the ref had initially counted Owen's shoulders down for the 3, but he waved off the call when he looked and realized that Owen's feet were on the bottom ropes. And Savage was so gravely offended by this blown call that he actively stated that he is now retiring from the wrestling business altogether. I said to myself, let the record show this was Randy Savage's rationale for wanting to quit the wrestling business. Because the 1-2-3 Kid got fucked out of advancing in a tournament round. Not even in the finals. The semifinals. Melodramatic much? Now, obviously, with Owen having the built-in advantage, they were going to keep the match on the shorter side. So Owen fought back at the end, countered a Hurricane Rana into a powerbomb, and then quickly submitted Kid with a sharpshooter. It's what you may call a valiant effort. But at that point, it set up our final round for the tournament, which we will cover in short order. First, we must unfortunately talk about this WWF Tag Title match. Yokozuna and Crush going up against the Head Shrinkers. Pretty much the epitome of, well, Yoko's no longer a main event title contender, but we're still paying the guy. So, what do we do with him? Well, The Undertaker still hasn't been cleared to come back yet. I know. Let's put him in a tag team feud with Samu and Fatu. Why not? We haven't already milked the evil foreigner gimmick enough, so we'll just send him right back into mid-card obscurity with Crush, Master Fuji, and poor old Jim Cornette. This is probably the lowest point in his career up to this point. It's always unfortunate when you go back and you cover the downfall of Yokozuna's status on the card. Because, man, even at this point in 94, despite the massive weight increase and, some of the health complications he was undergoing, God, he could still do some shit. He could bump. He could work. He wasn't there working top caliber matches with Bret Hart anymore, but even in this environment, when you look at the four guys involved, you could argue he was the best worker of the bunch. No offense to the other guys, but come on. Anyway, the match was a throwaway. Really nothing memorable. Heels worked over the champs toward the finish when we got probably one of the more hilarious yet epically great finishes of all time. The layers of train wreck comedy here were too much to handle. So Crush and Yoko are in control. And while Crush is the legal guy working over Samu, here comes Lex Luger. And he's standing in the aisleway trying to lure Crush to come out to the floor and fight him, possibly risking disqualification. And while Crush is distracted by that, they do a false finish where Samu tries to roll him up, but Crush ends up knocking him out to the floor. And then moments later, after Fatu just randomly gets into the ring without a tag, he ends up kicking Crush in the jaw. And if I'm not mistaken, I think he just ends up pinning Crush. Even though I don't believe he was the legal guy. And maybe Samu snuck in and stole the pin there, but in any case, the finish came out of nowhere. And that wasn't even in the best part. Art Donovan, he almost won me back here at the end. Almost. Not quite. But he almost got on my good side again. Now keep in mind too, when Luger came out for the first time, Savage and Monsoon had said the name Lex Luger about 100 times over. They were beating it into our heads. And after all this shit went down toward the finish, after Donovan had barely said one word for the previous 5 minutes, he finally chimes in with his stellar commentary, and he just simply goes, "Who's the guy with the American flag shirt?" And Savage, at this point, totally fed up with Donovan's bullshit, just screams to the top of his lungs, "That's Lex Luger!" I was dying at this point. Just beyond the point of turning this thing around for the better. They literally spoon-fed this fucking idiot this name over and over again. Lex Luger, Lex Luger. Remember that. Don't forget the name. Lex Luger. The dumbass still couldn't pick up on it. Unbelievable. I wrote down here in my notes, I am convinced this was the turning point for the Macho Man in the WWF. This was the point where he went to Vince after the show and said, "Dude, when my contract is up, I'm out. I can't handle this shit anymore. This is an embarrassment to the business and my reputation. If I have to suffer through another 4 to 5 years of special guest color commentators with guys that know little to nothing about wrestling, I don't want to be around to be any part of it." So I honestly think this was the moment where Savage put his foot down and gave up. And you know what, quite frankly, if I were in his shoes, if I was basically sent out there to try and carry a third wheel commentator for a 3-hour pay-per-view, I'd have probably quit after the show was over too. God, this was epically horrible. Made even better by seeing Luger out there in a red, white, and blue skin-tight singlet. Let me repeat that. A red, white, and blue skin-tight singlet. Lex Luger. Of all the pieces of ring gear I never thought I would see Luger in, the fucking singlet. He had one. He was wearing it. And now I think I'm starting to remember why he looked a lot better in short black trunks. He never went back. I don't think Luger wore another piece of ring gear for the entirety of his career. 5 stars. Thankfully, they turned things around here at the end, with Razor and Owen in the tournament finals. Well, not the end, because we had another thing after this. What probably should have been the main event, looking back, but, well, considering the finish they went with, I don't think they were looking to send the fans home on a dour note. This was still when Vince was pro-babyface, so, he was not going to send the fans home unhappy. Although with the finish they went with, set up a great series of angles for the story they were building up for the late summer. Don't want to get ahead of myself, though. Before we talk about all that, the fantastic finish they came up with here. And you know what, actually, before I even get there, let me talk about this. I don't think we should undersell the fact that this was both guys' third match on this card. Now, in all fairness, they weren't working what you'd probably coin lengthy main event style matches. I mean, mostly everything they did prior was kept under 6 minutes. But when you think about the conditioning that goes into working multiple matches on one card, it's not as easy as people might think it is. You know, Owen always had phenomenal cardio, but for a guy like Razor, him working 3 full-length matches on a card like this, that was probably a big ask of him. I thought he pulled it off extraordinarily well. Again, still at the point in his career, too, where he was still a technical workhorse. You know, he didn't phone it in either. And, you know, in terms of the spots they did, nothing was remarkably crazy. Very basic stuff with Owen trying to cut off Razor, doing some underhanded things behind the ref's back to try and cheat. You know, Razor fired back with a comeback at the end, but he ended up getting dumped out to the floor. And this is where all the Neidhart stuff came into play. Now, earlier, in one of those random backstage VTRs they aired, and I didn't talk about this, but Brett was seen backstage going through a lot of the locker room doors and trying to hunt down Neidhart, obviously wanting an explanation for leaving Brett in the dirt earlier while he was getting beaten up by Shawn and Diesel. Now we've come full circle about an hour or so later. Here comes the Anvil to assist Razor on the floor. Still technically a babyface at this point. And while Owen has the ref distracted, the Anvil helps Razor to his feet. And then pow! Gives him a big old nasty clothesline. Down goes Razor. And then he picks him up again and throws him into the ring post. Rolls him back into the ring. Owen goes up top. Flying elbow drop. 1, 2, 3. And of course the announcers are aghast. They are selling the gravity of the situation. Talking about how they did not see any of this coming. And how this is a shocking swerve for the ages. Without actually using the word swerve. You know, while Neidhart's celebrating with Owen and walking with him up the aisleway toward the giant throne gimmick, Owen's yucking up the whole coronation ceremony, just being a total douchebag. It's great stuff. And Neidhart presents him with the robe and crown. They got the generic fanfare music playing in the background. And right as Todd Pettingill is trying to present Owen as the 1994 King of the Ring, Owen cuts him off and declares that going forward, he will now be referred to as the King of Hearts, thus launching the brand new gimmick of Owen Hart for the remainder of the summer. It's just cartoony enough to be funny without being excessively insulting. And, well, you heard me talk about it before. How this was sort of the period when I was watching the WWF and I thought Owen was so damn entertaining. He was like one of the only heels in the company at this point that I was mesmerized by. Should have been a world champion, man. And I was like, how old at this point watching? Like 6 or 7 years old. And even I could have seen that Owen should have been a world champion. Just unfortunate we never got to see it. And the older I get, man, the more I continue to double down on that opinion. I mean, had the tragedy in 99 not happened, would Owen have been a champion for them? Possibly. Maybe. God, you think about the things he could have done. It's a damn shame. It really is. You know, and obviously we have the Anvil story, just another added piece of the pie as we approach SummerSlam 94. He's very instrumental in that whole resurfacing of the Owen-Brett feud, as we'll come to learn more about as we move forward with the Raw reports. Everything fell into place so perfectly here. And at this point, I just kept thinking to myself, boy, wouldn't that have been a great way to go out. Ending on a high note. Well, unfortunately, we can't do that. There was one more thing we had to cover. The main event. And what a main event it was. Whew. Roddy Piper versus Jerry Lawler. A match that, hypothetically, would have been ideal for both men to work in the territories about a decade prior. On paper, it seems enticing. Unfortunately, the year is now 1994, and to say that Piper has seen better days physically would probably be understating it. You know, Lawler was no spring chicken by this point either, let's be frank. The first match Piper worked since the WrestleMania 8 match with Bret Hart, I believe. Right when he dropped the Intercontinental strap to him. And Piper wasn't even in the best conditioning even back then. Man. And the sad thing is, having to mention how Piper was out of his element here in 1994. A couple years later, being out of the ring, and this was his comeback match. What they originally deemed to be a one-time only thing. And if you thought this was bad, you should go watch that Starrcade 96 match with him and Hogan in WCW. Good fucking God. Anyway. Well, here's the deal. They tried to smoke and mirrors as much of it as they could. You know, the first 5 or 6 minutes before the opening bell was Lawler going out there and doing a Heat promo, followed by Piper coming out with that scrawny kid that ribbed Piper in the King's Court segment a few weeks back. Apparently, somehow Piper managed to pay him off because now he was on the side of Piper as opposed to the King. I don't know what the deal with that was. Maybe Lawler stiffed him with a paycheck. In any case, he hung out at ringside for most of the match. Really didn't add much of value aside from the King getting in some heat spots with him occasionally. And, okay, well, maybe I'm exaggerating. In some ways, I'm being a little histrionic with the burial treatment. Was this as horrific as I'm chalking it up to be? Probably not. The thing you have to keep in mind with Lawler and Piper is that they're both genius workers, so they always find ways to make a shit sandwich somewhat edible, for lack of better terms. Considering where they both were in their careers at this point, I mean, you were only going to be able to get so much out of either guy, especially Piper. You know, Lawler using all the old school Memphis tricks. It worked in some ways. You know, Piper has that ability to sell and work the underdog role to where he always gets people invested. If you go in accepting the fact that you're not getting peak Lawler or peak Piper from the 80s, it's passable. The stuff with the fake Piper, that was a bit distracting and kind of unneeded if you go back and look at it. Yes, he did factor into the finish somewhat with Lawler hitting Piper with a foreign object and then trying to cheat by locking his feet under the ropes, and that's when the kid got involved and then pulled Lawler's feet away, so Piper ended up taking advantage of that and stacking up Lawler with something that kind of resembled a cradle pin, but not really. I don't know. It's really just kind of unfortunate how this match gets overlooked in the record books. People don't ever talk about this match. And even in the build-up to it, it never really came across on TV like anything other than a standard match on the card. It wasn't really treated like a big deal, barely got any attention outside the random snide remarks that Lawler would make on the King's Court segments. You know, tie in the weird VTR cameos that Piper was doing. But it had virtually nothing to do with the actual gimmick of King of the Ring. And if you honestly ask people if they remember a whole lot about the actual match, I think most experts or historians out there would say, not really. I mean, it was only really remembered for Piper coming out of retirement and sort of reintroducing himself for that one final full-time run. And even so, from an in-ring standpoint, I think this was the only return match that he had in the WWF before he left for WCW in 96. You know, he would do the program with Hogan then, and I think he would do a few more matches here and there sporadically, but he would stick around with the WWF for another year or two in mostly managerial roles. But as far as I remember, I don't think he worked another match under the WWF umbrella for years. God, I'd have to go back and look at his track record to see when he did work a match for Vince ever again. And there was like the weird things he was doing in like the mid-2000s with that Legends run. Oh, good Lord, I don't even want to think about all that. I don't know. I don't want to say it was a missed opportunity because they did the match. For what it was all right. I always wonder, though, could they have maybe set it up for something bigger, like a Survivor Series or a SummerSlam? Maybe spend a little more time building up the drama, you know, instead of making it basically a one-and-done blow-off and then moving on from it directly afterwards. I don't really know what the thought process was at the time, but this was pretty much the end of the Lawler-Piper saga in the WWF. They had the one match, and that was it. It was on to the next thing. I mean, the match still wasn't really all that good, if we're trying to really be nitpicky. But again, it's the genius of Lawler and Piper. They were good enough workers to sort of manipulate the crowd and get them to care about it by the end. You know, and as for the pay-per-view as a whole, it was sort of remembered as I had initially anticipated. You know, we remember the crowning achievement of Owen becoming King of the Ring. That's pretty much it. You know, the WWF title match with Diesel and Brett, even though it exceeded my expectations for having not remembered anything about it, it was still nothing people were ever going to talk about by the end of the year. Maybe outside the return of the Anvil. You know, and then there's the Lawler-Piper match, which kind of falls into that same category. Everything else was either tournament matches that felt like regular standard TV matches, and obviously the WWF tag title match that was rotten beyond all hope. Definitely one of the weaker pay-per-views we've recapped throughout this retro series, but boy howdy. Man, if you think things are bad now, woo! Just you buckle up, folks, because we are only scratching the surface. Those 1995 pay-per-view specials, you're going to be begging on your knees for King of the Ring 94 recaps by the time we get there. Man, oh man. And then there's SmackDown. What do we even title this one? In the archives of the Bloodline saga, maybe we ought to call it Crunch Time for Jey Uso. He's got an important decision to make this week. Will he stand by Cousin Roman on the island of relevancy, or will he side with his brother Jimmy, who's now been ousted from the Bloodline and forever banished into the realm of obscurity. I was trying to think of a yin and yang description for what Heyman always coins the island of relevancy. That was the best I could come up with. I thought it was kind of clever. Shut up. Anyway, well, given the fact that we're already sort of accustomed to the fact that nothing else matters on this show outside the Bloodline drama, figures we go ahead and just talk about that major story arc first. So after they went ahead and replayed the Jey Uso betrayal from last week, where Solo laid him out with the Oriental Spike, fast forward 1 week later, and now the story's kind of pivoted to the Jey Uso side of things. Last week, he stood there and watched while his brother went down to the Tribal Chief's muscle. Now, a week later, Roman's basically testing him to see if he'll fall back in line or choose the same fate that Jimmy did. So, start off with Solo and Paulie in the ring. Heyman's trying to get one word out, and then Jey interrupts him. And he's obviously pissed off about what happened last week. So he comes storming down to get in Solo's face, tells him that you don't turn your back on brothers. And like the great manipulative snake that he is, Heyman takes over, and he starts lulling Jey into a false sense of security, as only Paulie knows how. He's talking about how he's got the whole situation wrong. All of this, everything, falls at the feet of Jimmy. He's to blame. He made his decision, and now he has to live with the consequences. Jey, on the other hand, he's not to blame for what happened. And in fact, the rumor is that Jimmy has secretly envied Jey for months now. All because he caught wind that Roman was planning on grooming Jey to be his right-hand man, the future tribal chief of the Bloodline. And of course, I'm sitting there listening to Heyman say all this with a huge grin on my face. I'm just totally immersed in all this. I'm just thinking to myself, you fucking prissy weasel. And Jay's falling for it. Hook, line, and sinker. I'm like, you goddamn idiot. It's like the one thing I kept thinking in my head. Anyway, well, he sets up the theme for the night. Jey will get his opportunity to bring gold back to the Bloodline. Only this time, it will not be in the form of tag gold. It will now be in the form of singles gold. Specifically, the United States heavyweight title. Didn't know we're actually calling it the United States heavyweight title now. But sure, we'll go with that. I mean, they change belt names every 2 weeks anyway. By the way, currently held by Austin Theory, for those that forgot about that. Truth be told, I did. And, well, Heyman threw in one last remark here. He said that the Usos are no longer a thing, thanks to Jimmy's decision. I wrote down, one could only hope. And I actually kind of like how they concluded all this. Heyman's waiting for Jey to respond to the offer. So they're milking everything, as only WWE knows how. Jey goes, yeah, OG, I'll take you up on that U.S. title challenge offer. Then when Heyman goes to stick his hand out, there's like another 30 seconds of pause before Jey goes, hey, dog, I'm going to have to get back to you on that one. And, of course, the crowd pops as Jey leaves. He's got a big old smile on his face. And this is such great camera work. They slowly zoom the camera in on Paulie, and he's just standing there with his hand out, totally frozen. Literally like someone wiped their dirty ass with their other hand and then shook Heyman's. That was his expression. The only way that one would respond to a situation like that, just total shock. And, admittedly, it was a fine opening segment. Tell you what, say what you want about Heyman. I have my own opinions on the guy, but he's always been really good at getting you to care about matches and angles. He always knows how to set things up and always knows how to milk the gravity of the situation. Gives you a reason to want to see the title match. It's not just something they throw out there and randomly announce at the beginning of the program for no reason. It has stipulations. It has consequences. It has a purpose for happening. So I was on board. It also got my boy Austin Theory on the show, and certainly ain't going to complain about that. Not with the wrestling I watch most weeks. I also won't complain about my man LA Knight coming out for stellar commentary. Because anytime you get LA Knight in a speaking role on this show, you know you're in for something truly special. Yeah.
Yeah! I said pipe down, I'm talking!
It's probably the only reason I decided to stick around to watch the Santos Escobar Mustafa Ali Money in the Bank qualifier. I saw that graphic flash up on screen for like 5 seconds, and I'm like, do I want to watch this, or do I want to go take a piss? And then LA Knight's music hit, and I firmly placed my butt back into my chair. Wish you could have done color on a better match. I don't know. Honestly, I can't even really argue the match was bad. It was a modern style match where they do a million moves and dives, kickouts galore, going 100 miles an hour and trying to work it like it's a semi-main event match at WrestleMania. I mean, both guys are incredibly gifted athletes, so they're comfortable doing all the topes and the flips and the dives. Wish they maybe could have toned it down a little bit. And like, it wasn't AEW level ridiculous where they're just no-selling shit like 8 seconds after they hit a big move. But, I mean, when I say modern match, you can pretty much figure out what I mean by that. The only thing I can say that I hated about it was that both guys spent way too long fighting on the floor. And again, it's a thing I always bitch about with AEW TV matches, so I'm going to make sure I return the favor when I see WWE doing the same garbage. It's ridiculous. Why are guys allowed to fight on the floor for like almost an entire full minute? It's ridiculous. Just announce that the match is either no DQ or no countout, and we can be done with the conversation. But if the match is a standard regular TV match, I go in presuming that there are rules, that the talents had to adhere to regulations. They can't just go out there and do whatever the fuck they want. So, why is the ref not administrating 10 counts? Or if he is, why is he taking 3 years to count the 10? It's not that goddamn hard. Anyway, finish was kind of neat. Escobar hitting that phantom driver off the top rope to Ali. Took a little bit long to set up. Kind of made it visually off-putting, but yeah, Escobar going over wasn't all that shocking. He's sort of tailor-made for the modern ladder matches because they're going to inevitably do a bunch of dangerous stunt show shit. And Escobar would play right into it. He'll probably take a bunch of risky bumps because, unfortunately, that's what modern ladder matches are anymore. They're all designed to get big pops from all the stupid stunts people do. You know, in a lot of ways, it's actually kind of sad how I can project how it's going to go before the match even happens. But it's been like this ever since the days of the Attitude Era. Name me one TLC match you've ever seen since like 2000 where guys weren't just going out there and taking pratfalls and trying to find ways not to cripple themselves by going through furniture. I mean, you don't see Razor Shawn Michaels style ladder matches anymore, I'll tell you that much. And of course, because the men have their Money in the Bank match. You know, the girls are going to be factored into it too. All that bullshittery is going to play right into their hands. And if the guys are allowed to needlessly fall off shit and almost die, the girls should be able to do it too, right? Of course. It's that equality discussion that we all like having. Speaking of the girls, yeah. They got a lot of fucking screen time this week. Can't say I approved. And unfortunately, none of the girls' content was as classic as the Asuka Io Sky face-off from last week. So I was a little less lenient with the girls' content. We did, however, get Alpha Fire and Misty Blue for something resembling a promo. I should also mention the current reigning NXT Women's Tag Team Champions. Because, apparently those belts exist. Not enough that we have main roster tag belts for the girls, but the developmental system has to have a set. But of course, let's have 50-odd something belts in this company. I mean, AEW is doing the same thing. Everybody gets a belt. It's like Oprah Winfrey ought to be running this shit. Anyway, well, I think I mentioned this when they first announced their call-up. I've never seen these girls before. I had no prior knowledge of any work they had prior to getting called up. Oh my God, the names. Instant turnoff for me. Much like a lot of WWE revamp names. But, yeah. They're on SmackDown. Can they wrestle? Not a clue. Can they talk? Well, they did certainly utter something from under those giant holes under their nostrils. Not entirely sure what the hell it was they said, because their Scottish accents are thicker than molasses. I should also mention, very important, Ronda and Shayna were a part of this. They came out, essentially challenged Alpha and Misty to a title unification match. Said that the women's tag division isn't big enough for both teams. To which I said, it's not big enough for one team, much less two. But, sure. I guess it's WWE's way of course correcting so they can get rid of another set of pointless belts. I don't know. The match will be a thing. Ronda and Shayna versus Alpha and Misty. Good. Glad. I'm glad this is what they're paying Ronda Rousey for in 2023. Making her a totally superfluous mid-card act. Didn't this fucking woman main event WrestleMania at one point? Now this is what they got her doing. Ah, you know what? Whatever, I've been over the Ronda experiment for years anyway. She always kind of sucked. But that's just me. The dude with the controversial opinions on the internet. So, well, following that total waste of 2 minutes of precious TV time, this was the point where they aired the Iron Sheik tribute package, and I guess I should try to be a little more serious for this discussion. And then, point blank, this was a very good video package. And, you know, it's another case of a legend that's leaving us at a, well, I mean, I was going to say unexpected time. But then again, when you consider age and decline in health in the last several years, I guess it wasn't all that surprising. It was almost kind of like the Billy Graham story where the health issues were kept under the radar and news kind of broke the day of that he was in critical condition, not doing well, and not too long after that, boom. All the articles are coming up that he had passed away on whatever day it was. I guess it would have been Wednesday this week. I was at work when I saw the articles coming up. Conveniently, I think it was around the same time and place where I was reading about Graham's passing. Just, sitting there, and all of a sudden I start seeing everything kind of circulate. And, you obviously hate reading and seeing news like that, especially with legends that had such memorable legacies and careers. You think back to when they were in their prime, and I don't know. The Iron Sheik, man. You just sort of remember back in a time when wrestling used to have real heels and real baby faces. My God, was the Iron Sheik the perfect Vince McMahon heel. Like, you think back to his run in '83, coming in at the perfect time when Vince Jr. took over in the WWF. You were sort of in that transition period where you were looking to phase out some of the old guard. Hogan was coming up the pike. You needed that transitional heel champion to swap the belt over to Hogan in early '84. So, you do the thing in '83 where Sheik beats Bob Backlund. A couple months later, you sort of take off with the Hogan run by having Sheik drop the strap to him as the heel champ. It's probably around the time where I had started watching a lot of Sheik footage growing up. I didn't have a lot of access to his runs in Mid-South or Georgia, or even some of the stuff he was doing in Florida or Memphis. I mean, he was all over the place before the WWF run. And that's when he was in his mid-30s? When was he on the territorial run? Because he was already a late bloomer in the business. And man, still a fantastic athlete for his time. And when you consider all the stuff he put his body through, the fact that he could go in there and work to the degree he could in his early 40s in the WWF, it's amazing to think he ended up living into his 80s. That's the thing you hear so often about health complications and all the wear and tear those legends put on their bodies from back then. Factor in some of the performance-enhancing drugs a lot of guys were using back in the day. Like, that stuff takes a toll on the body. Sheik was a freak athlete, though, man. I think it's kind of a shame that his reputation was, I don't want to say tarnished, but maybe not seen in the most positive light, considering a lot of the stories about his personal life coming out later on. The arrest in '87 when he got pulled over carpooling with Jim Duggan. Both guys getting a DUI, and Sheik essentially exposing the business by having a babyface and a heel being seen together in broad daylight. More importantly, during a time when they were feuding. God. WrestleMania 3. You all remember that infamous story. And obviously there's the whole Twitter thing where, honestly, I've never kept tabs on that. I don't even know if he was running it or if that was something that he was hiring people to run the page for him. But all the crazy off-the-wall posts where he was basically telling the entire world to fuck off and go pound sand. It's entertaining. The idea that Sheik loved being a bad guy and was not afraid to embrace it. Man, if you're ever in the mood for some high-class comedy, if you need a good laugh, go browse Iron Sheik's trolling Twitter page. It's a sight to behold. I mean, I'm not on social media, so I have limited access to all the stuff since I don't have an account. A lot of that stuff is kind of kept under the, well, it's not a paywall, but you know what I mean. If you don't have an account, you can't actively go through Twitter and see a lot of people's posts. But I've seen the screenshots. So damn funny, man. Especially reading a lot of the comments. It's the pure embodiment of epic internet trolling to a T. The Iron Sheik had it figured out. But, good stuff, man. And, we obviously know how much he meant to the sport. Very controversial figure, but boy, was he a great worker. Great athlete, great promo, great personality. The kind of heel where, honestly, it's just a shame that you probably will never see villains like him ever again in wrestling. We live in such a toxic, politically correct world now. I don't know if you'd ever get away with being able to do the kinds of gimmicks like they were doing with Sheik back in the day. Spitting on the American flag, he'd probably be able to get away with that. But the whole idea of the Middle Eastern gimmick, the anti-American heel hating the morals and values of the United States. Obviously we were in conflict with the Middle East before, but remember when WWE tried doing gimmicks like that in the last 15 or so years? God, what was that poor guy's name? The one they pretty much ran out of the business altogether because they had to pull the gimmick due to all the controversy surrounding it. And the thing, the guy wasn't even Arabic. He was like Canadian from what I remember. I remember the last name was Hassan. I can't remember the first name of it. Damn it. It's going to bother me now. I'm not going to look it up, but you get the idea though. Gimmicks like that, the ones that have sort of been blacklisted from wrestling for being too edgy, being too polarizing. Like you look back at the gimmicks they were doing in the 80s and you just think the landscape of the world has changed. You really can't even work angles like that into wrestling anymore without people being offended. It's sad. The whole diversity, equity, inclusion bullshit that's destroyed culture and it's basically prevented us from being able to have these kinds of storylines incorporated into the business anymore. Again, all because we don't want to offend. It's like, come on. Nobody has a spine anymore. And while Sheiky's death is definitely sad, it's one of those things where you look back at his legacy and man, was he a great mind and a great talent. True icon. He really was. And I'm not just blowing smoke. I really mean that. Again, another one of those guys that was just a little before my time growing up, but you just think back and you're like, man, we're never going to get heels like him again. In more ways than one, I'm trying to delay the inevitable so we don't have to go back to talking about the show. Well, we can briefly skim over this next Money in the Bank qualifier. It's Bayley versus Michin, the former Mia Yim. Why her name is now Michin, I have no clue. I guess because Vince was feeling saucy one morning and said, I've got an idea. Michin. Now that's some good shit. Yeah, Vince. Yeah. And I like Mia. Nothing against her. I thought her work in NXT was solid from what I remember. She can work. She's a decent enough athlete. Bayley's good too. I mean, her and Sasha had one of the best modern women's matches I've seen in the last 10 years in wrestling, back when they were still in developmental. But, Bayley's proven she can work both aisles of the spectrum. She can be a great bitchy heel. She's also worked the friendly crowd-hugging gimmick too. There's nothing wrong with the talent involved. The match was short. Didn't get a whole lot of time. Kind of seemed rushed. Like they were legitimately told they had 5 minutes, so get in and get out. Mia hit a dive early on while Bayley was jaw-jacking with AJ. Mia did a few more things to Bayley until she yanked Mia face first into the corner buckle and then hit her with something and pinned her. I don't know what that something was. It was a move. I don't think they showed a replay. That's pretty much all there was to it. Bayley going over wasn't surprising. Io standing out on the floor was a little odd. Like her and Asuka were out there last week going at it on the microphone, and 7 days later, Io's just out there on the floor playing cheerleader. I mean, they worked it into story later on when she had her Money in the Bank qualifier, but it was just weird. And by the way, maybe somebody can enlighten me here. I possibly could have missed something. Where's Dakota Kai? Is she hurt? Did they kick her out of the group? What's going on there? As far as I know, I don't think the announcers have ever addressed it. Bayley and Io are just coming out together and Dakota's missing in action. No idea. But we weren't done with the segment here, because just when you think things couldn't get any more random, figuring AJ was out there for some reason, not just to do commentary, after Bayley won, Scarlett just sort of appeared out of nowhere so she could spit red mist into AJ's eyes. And then who should come up from behind but Karrion Kross? And he put AJ in a choke and left him for dead. Meanwhile, Bayley and Io completely vanished. Mia, I don't think we ever saw her again. And that was it. I was like, well, that was very random and out of the blue. Kind of reflective on a lot of Kross's run with WWE since he came back. Random, sparse, mildly bland. Speaking of random and out of the blue, beyond the Karrion Kross thing that nobody cares about. Well, it's been a good solid 7 days before WWE decided to dispense with the new toy belt. So it figures, 1 week after Roman got a new belt that they could immediately launch and sell on WWE's shop, figures now Asuka was going to get one. And, well, to be fair, they fixed the first issue. They're now eliminating the Raw part of the equation and just calling it the WWE Women's Championship. I don't know how that affects Rhea on the other brand, but sure, we'll go with that. Because, you see, they finally figured out, about 4 or so weeks after the draft, it's kind of stupid to have a Raw Women's Champion on SmackDown. It would probably make more sense to have the Raw Women's Champion, on Raw. Or maybe we just get rid of the belt altogether and start over. I figured that would have taken all of 2 seconds for somebody in the creative meeting to figure out. Instead, it took them over a month. Anyway, Asuka relinquished, disposed of, wiped her ass with the new Raw belt. She gave it to Adam Pearce, hopefully where it will now be tossed into a trash can and lit on fire. And now she's basically carrying the exact same belt that Roman was presented with a week ago. I don't think there's any difference. It's literally the same belt. I guess it just has the word women's on it somewhere. Just to differentiate it. Oh, and of course, just when you thought things couldn't get any more magical, here comes Charlotte Flair. At which point I begin to then rip out strands of hair one at a time, and I begin to staple gun them to my testicles, figuring that I was easily going to get more enjoyment out of that than having to watch Ric Flair with a vagina go out there and bore the brakes off of me like she's done for the better part of 10 plus years. Because you had to know, duh, WWE debuting a new toy belt design. Obviously, Charlotte was waiting in the wings to be the first to stick her fat, ugly nose in it. These people just can't help themselves when it comes to the incessant pounding of this fucking chick. God damn it. They just... They just won't stop. They literally will not stop with this fucking woman. She has become the Orange Cassidy of WWE for me. It's just like, no. You know what? Scrap that. That's actually an insult to Orange Cassidy. Charlotte is the fucking female John Cena of this women's division. Ram, force, pound, cram, shove. That's all they ever do with this blonde bimbo. They ram her down everybody's throat. It's ridiculous. They ram her down our throats more than she rams those Botox injections into her fucking lips. And you know what? At this stage, why are we even having the conversation? They may as well just do it. We all know what's coming. They're going to job Asuka out to Charlotte again. Just like they did years back when they fed her to Charlotte at WrestleMania and then ruined the only one good thing that Asuka had going for her entire career. The fact that she was unbeaten for her entire WWE run. Shit the bed on that one in a heartbeat. Because you knew they were inevitably going to build it up so Charlotte could beat her. Because that's what they do in this company. They build up women so they can feed them to Charlotte. They did it with Asuka. They did it with Rhea. I'm surprised they haven't done it with Bianca. So this pissed me off, as you'd probably come to expect if you've been watching this channel for more than 5 minutes. Charlotte Flair, not a fan. Her untalented, uncharismatic, botchy ass has been a detriment to this company for the last decade. I was relishing in not having to see her after WrestleMania, but I only knew it was a matter of time. Right back into the mix again. I mean, at this point, it's just comical. The fact that Pierce is like, Charlotte, what are you doing? You know you have to wait your turn in line. And she just goes, yeah, that doesn't work for me, brother. God. Is it any wonder I can't stand this chick? I mean, she's always been a terrible babyface. So evidently, that's exactly what they're going to make her out to be in this feud with Asuka. And even when she's a heel, it's ruined by the fact that her matches are always the shits. But you know what? Hey, people have been drinking the Charlotte Kool-Aid for years now, so whatever. It's like some of the people in AEW. You just can't convince them otherwise. It's the same people that think Orange Cassidy's the greatest thing in the world. It's like, whatever, dude. Keep watching with the blinders on. Maybe someday you'll learn, maybe you won't. I don't care. It doesn't matter. At least Rhea's on Raw now, so we know they won't end up feeding her to Charlotte at any point in the future. I mean, Asuka losing to Charlotte won't piss me off as much as it would if they just turned around and did the same thing with Rhea. I mean, it'll still suck, but only partially this go around. Oh, and by the way, Charlotte whiffing the big boot on Asuka after she ducked the miss spot. Epic. Just beautiful. Those classic botchy Charlotte spots we've all come to know and love. God, she's horrible. Just the goddamn shits. So, moving on. I'm ready to. God, I just realized how many women's segments in a row there were this week. Am I watching SmackDown or am I watching Shimmer? What's all the girl stuff? Seriously, the entire first hour was almost all girls content. I think like 70% of the show was girls content this week, now that I'm looking over my notes again. And of course, right as they go back to the men's content, who should they dish out there for a match but good old boring Corbin? Yeah, that'll do a great job keeping me interested in this program. So he wrestled Butch in a Money in the Bank qualifier. It was short. Not short enough. The finish was random and out of nowhere, but at least Corbin didn't win. It's about as much praise as I can give it. For whatever reason, Carmelo Hayes and his muscle were hanging out in the front row. I have no idea when Carmelo won the TNA X Division title, but that was the thing he was holding. And after Corbin lost, he went over and got punked out by Hayes and the Bodyguard. Cool. Maybe they'll feud on NXT where I don't have to watch them. That would be just fine with me. So I have nothing else to add there. Nor did I have anything to add about this next Money in the Bank qualifier. Of course, we're back to the women's stuff again. And if there's one girl in this company that irritates me as much as Charlotte Flair, it's Botchzy. Never understood the appeal, never understood the gimmick, never understood anything about her that makes people excited. She's got energy. Give her that. Unfortunately, none of that energy has ever been put into learning how to be a moderately competent pro wrestler. She wrestled with Io Sky in a Money in the Bank qualifier, and I have nothing against Io, but she's not going to get me to suffer through another Botchzy match. Much like the majority of other matches on the show, though, this was also short. So, while I did skip over it, I mean, it was only maybe like 5 or 6 minutes. And, well, kind of following up from earlier, that puts Io and Bayley in an awkward situation now, as they are both now Money in the Bank qualifiers. There's also a fly that just flew in front of my face, so if I smack the microphone, I apologize. Anyway, what was I talking about? Oh yeah, Bayley and Io. Yeah, so they're both in the women's ladder match now. So maybe they're teasing a breakup. Maybe one will cost the other. I don't know. We will see. We will see. How about we go ahead and just talk about the main event? Jey Uso versus Austin Theory for the United States Heavyweight title. Probably should have just made this the only thing I talked about on the entire show, now looking back. Because everything else that happened from the Bloodline opener to this match was devoid of merit, to say the least. I think I'm just going to title the entire show, Too Much Girls Wrestling, in all caps. And now that I said that, I have to do it. God, is that ever the truth? And then there was basically everything else that happened with Jey Uso, and the question is, did it make the show worthwhile? No. It was a stretch, but the Bloodline stuff, man, it's the only thing that's been carrying this program for the better part of the last year plus. Anyway, here's what we had here. We had about 10 minutes of stuff, and everything that happened in the lead to the finish, which is kind of the only thing worth discussing, really. So I'm just going to go ahead and skip to that because, I mean, you're really not missing out on a whole lot from anything that happened prior to the ref bump. Jey and Theory are trading blows. They actually do a cool lead up to the ref bump where Jey superkicked Theory and then Theory basically fell over into the official. And they were in good position for it, so it looked totally natural. And now Jey, of course, hits the big splash for the visual 3 count. And while Jey gets back to his feet, who should then hit the ring but Pretty Deadly? They've been pretty deadly to my eyesight and having to watch some of their segments in those skin-tight crop tops. And while I still don't really understand the appeal of the gimmick or honestly what their gimmick is even supposed to be, they were taken out by Jimmy Uso. And after Jimmy disposes of those two schmucks, who should come out next but Solo? And as he goes for the spike on Jimmy, Jey grabs a hold of his right hand and stops him in his tracks. And when it looks like Jimmy's about to return the favor by super kicking Solo, he ducks. So Jimmy ends up inadvertently connecting with Jey. And then Jimmy and Solo have a little awkward exchange at the end where I think Jimmy was supposed to dump Solo over the top rope out to the floor, but Solo kind of misjudged the distance between himself and the ropes. So he sort of got hung up and then rolled under the bottom rope. I mean, he got out of there, but it wasn't pretty. And then Jimmy did a dive too, which kind of looked like it almost ended horribly because Solo wasn't back on his feet yet, ready to catch him. So all you kind of see is Jimmy go flying over the top rope and Solo barely get his arms up to catch him. It was just kind of weird. Luckily, no one got hurt. And then Theory crawled over and stole the pin. Good little chaotic finish. You know, it worked for what it was designed to do. The pretty deadly thing I could have done without. Maybe I missed a backstage thing, but why were they even involved to begin with? I mean, last week, I think they worked a 6-man tag with Theory, but it's the only reason I could have thought they were out there. You know, and as far as the whole thing where Jey walked off from Jimmy at the end, stewing past Heyman and Solo up the aisleway and kind of leaving under his own accord. I mean, granted, it was like false advertising because the whole idea was, what will Jey Uso's decision be? And we didn't really get any clarity. I think Heyman got what he wanted with that smug look on his face. He knows he's driving the wedge between the Usos, and Jey's playing right into his hand. It's like the perfect role for Heyman, the sly piece of shit he is. And, you know, like I said, man, they got an interesting story going on right now with the Bloodline. Everybody's working their roles effectively. Everybody's being factored in somehow. No one's being hung out to dry. All the layers are tying back together. It's a slow burn, but it's working. I don't know where it's going. And that's the best part. I'm just waiting to see how the pieces of the puzzle all fit together. It's gone in a lot of different directions. And, you know, maybe you discount that little lull period after WrestleMania where the Usos and Kevin and Sami were going at it and didn't really seem like anything was really being developed. But they're kind of hitting on all cylinders again. So I'm intrigued. I'll stay with it. As long as this stuff is carrying the bulk of the SmackDown show, at least I have something to look forward to from week to week. But man, this show, dude, is way too 50-50 with the men and women stuff. And look, you know, you can call it whatever you want, but I'm going to continue to vent my frustration about this until the bitter end. There's no need for the girls to be getting this much screen time on a wrestling show. I understand they have a lot of female talent they need to try and spotlight in a given week, but I'm sorry. 5 girl segments in a 2-hour show, it's uncalled for. Especially when you consider the low market for women's content in wrestling, period. WWE's always going to have a more tolerant fan base when it comes to the men's and women's segments. Like, they'll put up with the bad shit more often than not. But I don't need to be seeing a wrestling show where the guys are almost getting, or having to take a backseat to the girls' stuff. It's just, I don't know. I mean, you have to have one girls' match in a given week. Fine. Maybe you throw in a promo or something like that. I can deal with that. One match and a promo. But like I said, the entire first hour was almost exclusively women's content. And not even good women's content at that. That's the more infuriating thing. We had a terrible brawl angle and promo with Ronda, Shayna, and the NXT newbies, followed by that short, mediocre Bayley and Mia Yim match that barely went 4 minutes, followed by another talk segment with Asuka and Charlotte that felt like it went for ages, followed a couple segments later by another short, equally pointless girls match with Io and Shotzi that barely went 2. I mean, you want to talk about the problem of the 50-50 egalitarian booking when it comes to modern wrestling, this one takes the cake. And again, some people are going to hate me mentioning this, but it's the fucking truth, people. There's not a market for it. There's just not. Women in wrestling should be a special attraction. You don't need to book the same amount of men's and women's content per show because you can. It's not needed. And more often than not, it weighs the show down. I mean, the majority of the matches this week were pointless anyway. Just a bunch of meaningless throwaway 5-minute nothing burgers. But when the girls are consuming so much of the airtime, it limits your ability to get over the guys' segments that quite frankly need more focal attention. You know, even AEW is smart enough to recognize that women's wrestling is a niche product. That's why we only usually see like maybe 1 or 2 women's segments on Dynamite every week. One match, maybe a promo, that's it. And that's all that's needed. More often than not, we don't even need the match and the promo. The realization is that the girls don't draw like the men. And whether we're talking AEW's market or WWE's market, it's kind of the same discussion. And again, it's fine. People, this is the way it's always been in wrestling, and it will continue to remain that way until the end of time. SmackDown does not have 15 Rhea Ripleys. They have one Rhea Ripley, and she's currently on Raw. On the SmackDown side of things, you got Bayley, you got Io. They're both good. Asuka's good in moderation, whenever she's not ranting in Japanese like an ear-piercing harpy. Bianca's good. I wish they'd turn her heel, but she's a good worker. They have female talent. They got a lot of female talent, actually. But isn't it enough to warrant them getting 5 or 6 segments on a TV show in 2 hours? Fuck no. Not at all. Not with the girls they were featuring this week. You know, for every Bayley and Io Sky you have on your roster, you have way too many Botchsies and Alpha Fires and Misty Blues, and I just call it the void filler. The mid-card girls that nobody really cares about. And we'll see how the numbers reflect in the ratings. Last week, they apparently did a huge number for that Roman 1,000th day title celebration. That was obviously going to pop a big rating, and good for them. They earned it. A lot of that stuff was good. But 1 week later, after watching this show and devoting almost the entire show to all girls content, it's going to be interesting to see how that ratings fares. My guess is not all that well. Anyway, I think we did enough damage for this weekend. Again, little bit of a stray from the path of what we were intending, but that's all good. Sometimes you need to throw a little Vince Russo swerve in there and keep people on their toes, you know? Just as long as we don't do it every week or every segment. Anyway, so Friday, it's looking like we're going to be back to kind of the regular Friday schedule. I don't foresee any swerves coming there. Next weekend, let me think about this for a minute here. So we have the Retro Raw, SmackDown, the AEW Collision show. I will be factoring that into the Monday show. At some point, I've got to have a discussion about what I want to do with the Dynamite program. For the foreseeable future, I'm going to continue with the Dynamite reports. I'm going to see how this Collision show goes. If it seems like it's going to be worth my investment more than the Wednesday night programs, I might just go ahead and cut the Dynamite cord altogether, man. Because those shows have been really bad for a long time now. And if the expectation is that all the bigger stars that I actually want to see are primarily going to be on the Saturday show, honestly, it might just be worth my investment focusing on that show. And, you know, maybe it turns into another Rampage experiment. Maybe it doesn't. But for where we are right now, I'm just kind of burnt out on the Dynamite thing. I really am. You know, I maybe watch the show and talk about a couple notes and big segments for the Friday program, but in terms of like full-length reviews of the shows, I don't know how much longer I can do it. I mean, I barely do it now. If you guys have been watching the Dynamite reports, how many of those matches have I been skipping over or just really not providing a lot of input for? Just nothing's really grabbing my attention at this point. I'm sick of the Orange Cassidy stuff. The BCC Elite stuff is just not my thing. CM Punk's going to be on the Saturday show. I think MJF's going to mostly be on the Saturday show now. Again, I need to see what the roster page looks like too. I mean, didn't they say that they were sort of shifting up how the talents were going to be dispersed? I mean, I don't even know if there's an official page. I mean, they have a graphic for it, but what does that really mean at the end of the day? I don't know. I really don't. Well, I'll keep you posted. How about that? So, take care, all. Thanks for checking it out. Peace out.